may have heard that to predict your health risks, you need to pay attention to your cholesterol, more specifically your LDL, right? But what if I told you that a simple measurement, a tape measure, and a simple bathroom scale could do a better job at predicting your mortality risk? So today we're talking about the Weight Adjusted Waist Index, or the WWI, a simple but powerful predictor of overall mortality and cardiovascular risk. So let's break down the WWI by starting with this paper by Han et al. In 2023. What they did is they wanted to find out what some of the best predictors for cardiovascular mortality and overall mortality were. So they looked at a variety of different things like LDL, cholesterol, blood pressure, BMI, and the WWI. So what did they do? Well, they looked at over 26,000 US adults, 50% women, 50% men, and they followed them for about 6 years. And what they ended up finding was that people with a higher weight adjusted waist index, or WWI, had a 68% increased risk of dying from any cause and a 95% increased risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. However, when LDL was examined, they found that those who survived actually had higher LDL than those who had passed away during that 6-year period. So no, I didn't misspeak there. Over the 6-year period of 26,000 US adults, the LDL was lower in those who died than those who survived. So in the end, WWI was a much stronger predictor of mortality than LDL. So maybe you're wondering what exactly that means when we say someone with a higher WWI had a 68% increased risk of dying compared to those with a lower WWI, or a 95% increased risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to those with a lower WWI. Well, relative risk just means like how much more likely is something to happen to one group compared to another group, right? However, the strength of a predictor isn't just about the relative risk. It's about how consistently and strongly it can differentiate between groups. So this study showed that the WWI had a much larger impact than other variables, meaning that people with a higher WWI consistently had greater risk of mortality. And this makes WWI a far more useful tool for assessing health. So what does all this mean? Well, LDL, which many people focus on, was not a good predictor of mortality in this study, while WWI was, right? And this is not surprising considering many other studies have shown that higher LDL is inversely proportional to mortality in older adults. So I'll just repeat that. It's inversely associated, meaning higher LDL, lower mortality in older adults. Take, for example, this study in the British Medical Journal, where they looked at 19 different cohort studies. And they concluded that high LDL-C, or high LDL cholesterol, is inversely associated with mortality in most people over 60 years old. This finding is inconsistent with the cholesterol hypothesis. In other words, that cholesterol, particularly LDL-C, is inherently atherogenic. Atherogenic meaning something that causes atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease. Since elderly people with high LDL-C live as long or longer than those with low LDL-C, our analysis provides reason to question the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis. Now, it's not my objective to pick on LDL in this video. My point is that the Weight Adjusted Waist Index is a very valuable test, and it's a very simple test, and you don't need a blood test to measure WWI, just as I said, a tape measure and a scale. Now, it's not just about the risk of dying, though. There's so much more to it than that. Take, for example, this study that was just published a couple weeks ago. The WWI is strongly correlated with cognitive decline in Chinese men. Well, I'm not a Chinese man, you might say. Okay, fine, but that's not just the only study. There was another study just published in June of 2024 where they looked at the same thing in the US population, which was split evenly between men and women, and they said in elderly individuals in the United States, an increase in WWI was associated with an increased risk of cognitive decline. Furthermore, the relationship between WWI and cognitive decline was proved stronger than other obesity indices, indicating that WWI could serve as a reliable indicator of cognitive decline. So what do they mean by other obesity indices? Well, the most common ones that people are familiar with is BMI and waist circumference, right? So you might say, well, why do we need this new thing? Why don't we just look at BMI? And the simple answer is that BMI falls short on a lot of aspects, right? So it takes your body mass and your height. So someone who's very muscular may have a lot of mass to them, but very low body fat, and the BMI might list them as overweight or obese. Conversely, somebody with low muscle mass but high amounts of visceral fat might get listed as normal in the BMI. The WWI, on the other hand, adjusts for waist circumference and body weight, making it a much better indicator of body composition and health risk. In fact, that study that we talked about at the beginning with Han et al., they talked about this and they said, furthermore, serving as a comprehensive predictor, WWI exhibits a significant positive correlation with all prognoses related to cardiometabolic disease, morbidity, and mortality, whereas BMI and waist circumference do not demonstrate such a relationship. Okay, so how do you measure WWI? Well, it's simple. You just take your waist circumference at the height of your belly button in centimeters, and then you weigh yourself in kilograms, and then you divide your waist measurement by the square root of your height. Now, if you don't have the patience to be converting pounds into kilograms and inches into centimeters, that's fine. There's a lot of online calculators like this one that can help you out, and I'll leave a link below. Now, if your WWI in this study that we're talking about was greater than 11.33, many studies suggest that you have a significantly increased risk of mortality and cardiovascular disease. But obviously, that number of 11.33 varies between studies, but it's usually around that area, right? So it's not like if you're 11.32, you're fine, and if you're 11.34, you're gonna die next week. There's obviously shades of gray to this whole thing, so take that with a grain of salt, right? But the general idea is the higher the WWI, the more risk you have for mortality. So to wrap all this up, health doesn't always require expensive tests, right? The WWI is a simple, inexpensive, yet powerful test to assess your health risks. So instead of relying solely on LDL, rely on something that looks at your body composition and real health risks. So check your WWI today. It might be the most insightful health measurement you can do without a blood test.